One of the ancient world's most extraordinary cities was hidden so well that the West lost track of it for more than 6 centuries. In the year 1812, a young Swiss traveller crossed the deserts of Jordan under a false name. Following local talk of ruins that no European had documented in living memory, his guide led him into a crack in the mountains, a corridor of stone barely wide enough for 2 camels, with walls rising 300 feet overhead. Then the canyon opened, and a carved facade the size of a 12-story building looked back at him, cut, not built, cut from a wall of rose-colored rock. He had found Petra, but the building was never the real story. The real story is the people who made it. Desert traders who coaxed water out of one of the driest places on earth, who farmed floods, who worshipped gods with no faces, who grew rich enough to concern Rome, and who then slipped so completely out of Western memory that even their name was nearly lost. This is their story. Chapter 1. The Edge of the Map. Every map has an edge. For the great powers of the ancient world, for Egypt on the Nile and the empires of Mesopotamia. That edge ran through the deserts south of the Dead Sea. Beyond it lay a landscape that seemed designed to reject human life. Sandstone mountains twisted into shapes that looked less like geology than like frozen weather. Summer heat pushing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Rainfall of roughly 6 inches a year, much of it arriving all at once, in flash floods that could kill a caravan in minutes. To a king in Babylon or a pharaoh in Thebes, this land was not a place. It was the space between places. That assumption, repeated by powerful people for centuries, is exactly what made the land valuable. The worth of a location is never fixed in the ground. It depends on who is looking and what they need. To an empire that measured wealth in wheat fields and taxpayers, southern Jordan was worthless. To a trader moving frankincense from Arabia toward the Mediterranean, its wells and passes were the difference between profit and death. Look closer, and the empty land starts to give up its secrets. The mountains form a natural fortress with only a handful of usable entrances. The basin where Petra would rise sits roughly 3,000 feet above sea level, which softens the desert heat and catches a little more rain than the lowlands. And hidden in the rock are springs. Not many, but enough. The most famous, Ain Musa, the spring of Moses, still flows today. And local tradition holds that this is where Moses struck the rock and water came out. History cannot confirm that story, but the tradition tells you something true anyway. People have treated water in this valley as a miracle for a very long time. The first people we can clearly name here are the Edomites. From roughly the 13th century BC, they held a kingdom in these highlands. And the name may sound familiar because Edom appears throughout the Hebrew Bible as Israel's difficult neighbor. The nation descended, according to the book of Genesis, from Esau, the brother of Jacob. Archaeology gives them solid form. Excavations at their capital of Busera and at other sites have uncovered fortifications, administration, and large-scale copper production in the valleys below. This was an organized kingdom that made real money from mining and from taxing the traders who passed through. One Edomite site matters especially for this story. High above the future site of Petra stands a flat-topped mountain called el Biara, the mother of cisterns. The British archaeologist Crystal Bennett excavated its summit in the 1960s and found an Edomite settlement from around the 7th century BC, including a seal impression naming an Edomite king. Consider what that location choice says. They lived on top of the rock, hard to reach, easy to defend, close to the rain. The lesson of this landscape was already written before the Nabataeans arrived. Whoever holds the heights and the water holds everything. Then history turned. In the 6th century BC, Babylonian expansion disrupted the political order of the whole region, and over the following centuries, Edomite political power shifted westward into southern Judea. Into the space they left came somebody new, nomads out of Arabia, moving with camels and tents, probably speaking an early form of Arabic while using Aramaic for much of their writing, worshipping their own gods, following trade routes the way other peoples follow rivers. The Nabataeans, an honest storyteller has to slow down here, because Nabataean origins are genuinely murky. They enter written history quite suddenly, and everything before that is inference. Some scholars have tried to link them to a tribe called Nabataean in Assyrian records, but the connection is disputed. What the evidence does suggest is a gradual arrival rather than a conquest. Pottery and inscriptions indicate that Nabataean groups were established in the region by the 4th century BC, settling among communities where Edomite traditions had not simply disappeared. History rarely moves in clean lines. One people fades into another like watercolors bleeding on wet paper. We do have one priceless snapshot of the newcomers, from the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who drew on an eyewitness account from the late 4th century BC. He says they numbered about 10,000. He says they raised camels and sheep, and that their law forbade them to plant crops, build houses, or drink wine. Why forbid those things? Because, Diodorus explains, anything you build can be taken from you, and anyone who cannot find you cannot conquer you. Their wealth they carried with them, or id. And most remarkably, he reports that they dug hidden cisterns in the desert, lined them with plaster, filled them with rainwater, and marked them with signs that only they could read. That detail is the seed of everything that follows. Before the Nabataeans carved a single tomb or minted a single coin, their first great invention was invisible water, a network of survival written into the desert floor, worthless to any army or tax collector who did not hold the key. Their earliest infrastructure was, in effect, a hidden map that made an impossible land possible, but only for them. So picture the board around the year 320 BC. The old empires saw a wasteland. The Edomite kingdom had proven that organized life was possible here, then moved on, and a small nation of camel traders now held the heights, the springs, and the secret cisterns, sitting quietly on the corridor that connected the incense lands of Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean. They owned almost nothing an empire could count. No cities to besiege, no fields to burn, no palaces to loot. One of the great military powers of the age was about to discover what that meant. In the year 312 BC, the successors of Alexander the Great looked at the edge of their map, saw easy prey, and sent an army into the rocks. Chapter 2. The people who refused to be caught. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in the year 323 BC, he left behind one of the largest empires the ancient world had yet seen, and no plan for who should run it. His generals solved that problem the old-fashioned way. They tore the empire apart and fought over the pieces for 40 years. Historians call them the successors. Among the most dangerous of them, in those early rounds, was a one-eyed veteran named Antigonus, a man in his 70s who controlled most of the Middle East and intended to control the rest. In 312 BC, Antigonus turned his attention to the desert south of the Dead Sea. His reasons were practical. The region produced bitumen, the black tar that Egypt bought in bulk for embalming its dead. It sat on the flank of his rival Ptolemy in Egypt, and through it flowed the incense trade, which meant silver. The people who held that desert were rich, few in number, and had no city walls. On paper, this was easy money. So Antigonus gave one of his officers, a man named Athenaeus, 4,000 infantry and 600 cavalry, and sent him to take it. Our source for what happened next is Diodorus Siculus, preserving an eyewitness account from that generation, and the story he tells reads like a heist that goes perfectly right and then catastrophically wrong. Athenaeus did his homework. He learned that the Nabataeans held a yearly gathering, a kind of national market festival, and that during it the men left their elders, their women, their children, and their most valuable goods on top of a certain rock, a high place, a refuge. Many scholars believe that rock stood at or near the future site of Petra. Though the identification is debated, Athenaeus timed his attack for the moment the rock stood undefended. He drove his men roughly 250 miles in 3 days and nights. According to the ancient account, struck the rock at midnight, killed or captured everyone he found, and marched away before dawn with a fortune in frankincense, myrrh, and about 500 talents of silver for about 24 hours. It was the most successful raid of the age. Then the desert did what the desert does. Athenaeus assumed no one could react in time, so he let his exhausted army sleep with minimal guards. The Nabataean men, warned by survivors, came back across that same distance at a speed he had not believed possible. Diodorus reports that they struck the camp at dawn, killed the infantry almost to a man, and that only 50 horsemen escaped, most of them wounded. Out of 4,600 soldiers, 50 came home. Now comes the detail most retellings skip, and it may be the most important one. The Nabataeans did not celebrate and wait for the next round. They wrote a letter. Diodorus says they sent Antigonus a message written in Syrian characters, meaning Aramaic, the business language of the Middle East, defending what they had done and blaming his own dead officer for starting it. Sit with that for a moment. These supposed primitive tent dwellers answered a massacre with written diplomacy. In the international legal language of the day, they understood something every small nation pressed against a great power eventually learns. Winning the battle is step one. Giving the emperor a dignified way to back down is step two. And it is the hardest step. Antigonus took the exit they offered. He wrote back politely, agreed that Athenaeus had acted without orders, and then, being Antigonus, began planning a second attack. This time he sent his own son Demetrius, a young commander who would later earn the nickname Besieger of Cities, with 4,000 cavalry and 4,000 light infantry. But surprise was gone, and without surprise, every Nabataean strength switched on at once. Diodorus describes lookouts on the heights, fire signals running across the desert faster than any horseman, herds scattered beyond reach, treasure locked on the rock, and defenders waiting above the one narrow ascent. Demetrius attacked, got nowhere, and paused. Then, according to Diodorus, one of the Nabataean elders called down to him a short speech that deserves to be better known than it is. The gist was this: King Demetrius, what do you want from us? We live in a desert, in a land with neither water, nor grain, nor wine, none of the things your people cannot live without. We chose this life so that we would be slaves to no one. Take our gifts and go home, and the Nabataeans will be your friends. But if you attack us, you will only suffer, and you cannot change the way we live. And any prisoners you take will be miserable slaves who cannot forget how to be free. Whether those exact words were spoken, we cannot verify at this distance. Diodorus wrote decades later, working from an earlier account, and ancient historians routinely composed speeches to convey what a moment meant. But the outcome is not in dispute. Demetrius accepted gifts and hostages, declared something like victory, and marched off to harvest tar at the Dead Sea instead. The Nabataeans disrupted even that. A formidable military machine had come for the desert twice, and gone home twice. The reason is worth stating plainly, because it explains the next 400 years. The Nabataeans did not win because they were stronger. They won because they had engineered their entire society to be unprofitable to attack. No fields to burn, no city to besiege. Water hidden where only they could find it. Mobility that made pursuit pointless, and a defended rock for everything that could not move. In modern terms, they had no attack surface. Conquest is a business, and they had quietly arranged matters so that every invader would spend more than he could ever take. And then, having proven they could not be caught, the Nabataeans did something no observer would have predicted. Over the next 2 centuries, the nation whose law forbade houses and crops began, slowly and deliberately, to build the very things it had sworn never to build: houses, fields, a capital. To understand why they took that risk, you have to understand what was riding on those camels. Chapter 3. Liquid Gold. Picture a typical caravan morning somewhere in southern Arabia. We have no record of a particular departure, but the conditions are well documented. So, imagine the ordinary version of a scene that happened thousands of times. It is cold. Desert nights are cold, and the men work with their hands tucked into their sleeves between tasks. 200 animals, maybe more, complaining as the loads go on. Each camel carries sacks packed with pale golden lumps that look like nothing much, like gravel, like dried sap, which is what they are. Then a stray crumb falls in the cooking fire. and a ribbon of white smoke lifts into the dark, and for a moment the whole camp smells like a temple. That smell is the cargo. That smell is why every man here is armed. The lumps are frankincense, the hardened resin of a low, twisted tree that grows almost nowhere on earth, mainly in a narrow band of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Its darker cousin, myrrh, comes from a related tree and was worth even more. To understand Petra, stop thinking of incense as a pleasant smell and start thinking of it as a strategic commodity. Temples in Egypt burned it daily. Greek and Roman worship required it. Roman funerals consumed it in quantities that sound invented, because cremation without incense was considered shameful poverty. It went into medicine, cosmetics, and embalming. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder claimed that the Emperor Nero burned more incense at the funeral of his wife Poppaea than Arabia produced in an entire year. That figure is almost certainly rhetorical. Pliny was a moralist writing about Roman excess, not an auditor. But the exaggeration only works if the underlying picture was real. And the underlying picture was this: demand for a product that grows in one corner of the world, from customers 1,000 miles away, with money to burn. That combination creates one of the oldest stories in economics, a supply line worth fighting over. Now the map, the incense grew in the far south of Arabia, in what is now Yemen and Oman. The customers lived around the Mediterranean. Between them lay hostile desert, crossable only by camel, only along certain routes, only by reaching certain wells in a certain order. Pliny describes the journey as 65 stages, and he complains, in the tone of a man reviewing an outrageous bill, that the caravans paid and paid and paid along the way, fees for water, fees for fodder, fees for guides and protection. By his accounting, the accumulated costs on each camel load came to nearly 700 denarii before the cargo reached the sea, and the finest myrrh could sell in Rome for as much as 50 denarii per pound. Put that in human terms. A single pound of top-grade myrrh could cost more than a month of wages for an ordinary Roman laborer. Perfume priced like jewelry. And where did those desert roads converge as they bent toward the sea? The routes came up out of Arabia, and the wells and mountain passes funneled them, road by road, into the country of the Nabataeans. Petra grew at the junction where the incense roads met the ways running west to Gaza and the Mediterranean, north toward Damascus, and east toward the Persian Gulf. This was never a single highway with a single gate. And the Nabataeans were never merely toll collectors. Think of Petra as a commercial hub on a web of routes. Part customs station, part marketplace, part logistics center. The Nabataeans guided caravans, guarded them, supplied them, financed them, and taxed them. They did not grow a single frankincense tree, and they did not own the ships in the Mediterranean ports. They owned the middle. In a trade network, the middle is where the profit concentrates. One thing made their middle nearly unbeatable, and it was the thing from Chapter 1, water. A caravan that has crossed 1,000 miles of sand will pay almost anything for guaranteed wells. Safe rest. honest guides, and protection from raiders. The hidden cisterns of the old nomad days had become the foundation of a service no rival could easily copy. On Nabataean roads, under Nabataean protection, the desert became survivable. At a price, and the price bought something real. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the time of the Emperor Augustus, shows us what the revenue built, and he had an unusually good source. His friend Athenodorus, a philosopher who lived in Petra for a time. Through those eyes we glimpse a city full of foreigners, Romans among them, walking its streets. A city so orderly that lawsuits between locals were rare. A king who, Strabo claims, held public accountings of his administration. We cannot verify every detail, but the picture is consistent. Money was pouring in, and it was being managed rather than merely hoarded. The deeper point separates the Nabataeans from most wealthy nations of the ancient world. Their fortune was made of knowledge, not land, which can be seized, not mines, which can be captured, knowledge, where the water was, which routes were safe in which season, which tribes to pay, which to avoid, how to move something valuable across a wasteland and have it arrive. The empires around them measured wealth in territory. The Nabataeans quietly demonstrated that in the right circumstances, information beats territory, but a fortune built on roots carries a weakness, and whether they thought about it consciously or not. Their behavior over the next 2 centuries looks like the response of people who understood it. A road is only a habit, and habits change. So they converted. They turned flowing revenue into fixed advantage. And the conversion did not begin with monuments. It began with something far less photogenic, spread across hundreds of miles of desert, in places most tourists have never heard of. Chapter 4. The Empire of Small Places. Here is a fact that surprises most visitors to Petra. The city was never the whole point. Petra was the capital of something much larger. A network of towns, forts, ports, farms, and watering stations stretching from Syria in the north to deep inside the Arabian Peninsula. To understand the Nabataeans through Petra alone is like judging a railway company by the architecture of its main station. Start with the problem they solved first, which was food. A caravan network needs feeding, and imported grain is expensive, but this is a land of 6 inches of rain a year, all of it arriving in violent bursts. So the Nabataeans and their neighbors developed a technique that sounds like a contradiction. Farming with floods. The method, still visible across the Negev desert in modern Israel, works like this. You do not wait for rain to fall on your field, because there will never be enough. Instead, you treat entire hillsides as collection surfaces. Low stone walls and shallow channels are laid across the slopes to catch the sheet of water that races off bare rock during a storm, and to funnel it from many acres of hillside into a single small terraced field on the valley floor. That field receives not its own 6 inches, but the runoff of everything above it: barley and wheat, grapes and olives, on ground where nothing should grow. We know this system worked because a botanist proved it in the 20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, the Israeli scientist Michael Evanari and his colleagues reconstructed ancient runoff farms near the ruins of Avdat, rebuilt the channels and terraces on the original plan, and planted crops. The farms produced 2,000 years after the last Nabataean farmer walked away. His engineering still returned a harvest. Modern desert agriculture programs have studied those results ever since. Which means the caravan people of Petra are, in a small way, still consulting on the problem of feeding dry places, now widen the map. Along the routes running west toward the Mediterranean, the Nabataeans and their successors built a chain of desert towns: Avdat, Shifta, Mamshit, Haluza, and others, each with cisterns, caravanserais, and fields. UNESCO inscribed that chain as a World Heritage Site in 2005 under the name of the incense route and the desert cities of the Negev, precisely because the surviving towns and forts show how an entire commercial corridor was engineered rather than merely traveled. Push south instead, deep into what is now Saudi Arabia, and you reach the most startling thing outside Petra itself: Hegra, known to Arab tradition as Madain Sali. In the Al-Ula region, it was the Nabataean kingdom's great southern city, and it holds more than 100 monumental rock-cut tombs carved in the same style as Petra's, standing not in a canyon but scattered across open desert. Isolated sandstone outcrops rising from the sand, with palaces of the dead cut into their flanks. In 2008, it became Saudi Arabia's first UNESCO World Heritage Site, and Hegra gives historians something Petra almost never does. Its tomb facades are inscribed. Many carry the names of the people who commissioned them, the craftsmen who carved them, the date of the work, and legal formulas warning what penalties would fall on anyone who misused the tomb, where Petra's monuments stand silent and anonymous. Hegras speak in ordinary voices about property, family, and law. One tomb belongs to a woman who commissioned it in her own name. Another sits unfinished, its upper crown fully carved, the rock beneath it untouched, frozen exactly the way the work was abandoned. The network reached the sea as well. The Nabataeans held ports on the Red Sea, and a 1st-century Greek merchant handbook called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea describes a Nabataean port where an official collected a duty of a quarter on incoming goods, protected by a garrison. Scholars still debate exactly where that harbour stood. What matters is the shape it implies: sea traffic, land traffic, customs officers, and garrisons, all under one administration. Northward, the trading city of Bosra in southern Syria became a major Nabataean centre and later a Roman provincial capital. Eastward and southward, Nabataean names and prayers are scratched by the thousands onto rocks in Wadi Rum, the Sinai, and the deserts of Arabia. The graffiti of drivers and caravan guards marking the long, empty hours. Put all of it together and the picture changes. This was not a fabulous city that happened to sit in a desert. It was a desert made functional at continental scale, and the city was its headquarters. Every element supported the others. Run-off farms fed the stations. The stations watered the caravans. The caravans generated the revenue. The revenue paid for more farms, more cisterns, more forts, and eventually for the monuments that make people gasp today. There is something quietly moving about that hierarchy, and it inverts the way we usually rank human achievement. The buildings everyone photographs sit at the top of a pyramid whose base is a low stone wall on a hillside, built by someone whose name is gone, designed to catch water that fell for 20 minutes in February. The Nabataeans understood exactly which of those two things they could not live without. Which brings us to the place where their water skill reached its highest form, not the farms, the capital itself, and the 60-foot deep problem sitting at its front door. Chapter 5. The Water Masterminds. 6 inches. That is roughly the rainfall Petra receives in an entire year. And even that arrives in the worst possible way. Not as gentle showers spread across the seasons, but as a handful of violent winter storms dumping water onto bare rock. Rock does not absorb rain. It launches it. Within minutes of a storm, dry canyons turn into brown torrents strong enough to roll boulders, and an hour later it is gone, drained into the sand, useless. So the Nabataeans faced a double problem that sounds like a riddle. Their city had too little water, and their city had far too much water. The answer they engineered, over roughly 2 centuries, was a single integrated system that addressed both at once. Catch the flood before it kills you. Store it before it escapes you. Modern researchers who have mapped the system, most notably the American engineer Charles Outlive, who published a detailed hydraulic study of the site, describe a network of hundreds of components: dams, channels, pipelines, settling basins, and cisterns, working together across an entire watershed. Start with the threat. The main entrance to Petra is the Sic, that winding crack in the mountain, more than half a mile long and in places only 10 feet wide. The Sic is not just a corridor. It is a natural drain, and the wadi that feeds it collects storm water from miles of highland. In its raw state, the city's front door was also the barrel of a gun. The Nabataean solution still stands at the entrance today. They built a dam across the mouth of the wadi, blocking the water's ancient path, and cut a tunnel through solid rock, about 290 feet of it, to throw the floodwater into a different canyon that loops around the city. Archaeologists date the major works to around the 1st century BC. They did not merely defend against the flood. They redirected it, took the desert's most dangerous weapon out of its hand, and sent the water where it could be caught and kept. Because catching it was the point. Across the mountains around the city, channels carved along cliff faces intercepted runoff and steered it into cisterns cut into living rock. Walls sealed with waterproof plaster. Openings small and easy to cover, which limited evaporation and kept them inconspicuous to strangers. This was the old nomad trick from Diodorus, scaled up to serve a capital. Estimates of total storage vary and deserve caution. But Outlive's work suggests the system could hold on the order of 40 million litres. In theory, that represented an enormous reserve, potentially enough to carry the city through long, dry spells, and enough to make the oldest siege tactic in the world: cut the water and wait. A poor bet here, storm water, though, was the insurance half of the supply. Daily life ran on springs. A bowel Ain Musa, rising in the hills miles east of the city. Moving that water to Petra meant solving a problem that ruins most gravity systems. Too little slope and water stalls. Too much, and it accelerates. Hammers the joints, and tears the line apart. The Nabataean answer was a pipeline of thousands of interlocking terracotta segments, each about a foot long, socketed and sealed, running along a shelf cut into the wall of the Sikh itself. Ortloff's analysis found the line held to a gentle downhill grade of only a few degrees, with basins along the route to settle out sediment and calm the flow. Walk the Sikh today, and you can still see that channel beside you at shoulder height. The city's original water main, hiding in plain sight while the crowds photograph the cliffs. Put it together, and Petra becomes something close to a paradox. A desert city with redundant water systems. Spring water piped in daily for drinking. Floodwater banked in cisterns for the dry months. Separate lines and separate storage, so that a failure in one part of the network did not necessarily threaten the whole city. Ancient writers noticed the strategic result. When Strabo describes hostile armies struggling in this desert, the picture is always the same. The land itself fought for its owners, because only its owners knew where it kept its water. And beyond survival, there was swagger. Strabo's informant describes gardens and freely flowing water inside the city. And excavation has confirmed a monumental pool and garden complex in the center of Petra. A water display in a wasteland is not decoration. It is a message to every arriving merchant. And the message reads, "We are so rich that we spend water on flowers. We remember civilizations by what photographs well. So the world remembers Petra for its carved facades. But the facades are the receipt, not the achievement. The achievement is the buried system that made the city possible. The tunnels and cisterns and humble foot-long pipe segments that turned 6 inches of hostile rain into fountains. Every city you have ever loved runs on layers of equally unglamorous infrastructure that nobody photographs, and that everybody notices on the day it fails. The desert made sure that lesson stayed legible. In 1963, long after the ancient pipes fell silent, a flash flood roared down the unmaintained Sikh while tourists were walking it. Reported death tolls vary, but roughly 24 people drowned. In the very passage the Nabataeans had tamed 2,000 years earlier. Jordanian authorities afterward rebuilt a dam at the Sikh entrance, on the footprint of the ancient one, and reopened the old diversion path. The modern world, with all its machines, ended up copying the nomads' homework. Water security changed what the Nabataeans could afford to be. A people who no longer feared thirst, no longer needed to stay ready to scatter. The tents could become houses, the refuge rock could become a capital, and a nation of traders was about to discover it needed something it had never owned before: a government. Chapter 6. From Tents to Thrones. Somewhere in the 2nd century BC, a line was crossed that no one announced and no one recorded. The Nabataeans, whose law once forbade planting crops and building houses, who had told Demetrius that freedom meant owning nothing a king could take, began living in permanent homes, farming terraced fields, and obeying kings of their own. If you have followed this story from the beginning, that should feel almost like a betrayal of the founding idea. So why would a people abandon the exact strategy that had kept them free? Because wealth changes the arithmetic of freedom, mobility protects you when you are poor, since there is nothing to take. But by the 2nd century BC, the Nabataeans were not poor. They were running warehouses, contracts, caravan schedules, and diplomatic relationships across hundreds of miles. That kind of wealth cannot ride a camel. It has to sit somewhere, be guarded, be adjudicated when partners quarrel, and be represented when foreign envoys arrive. Every successful merchant people in history reaches the same fork in the road: stay light and stay small, or settle down and scale up. The Nabataeans chose scale, and they managed the transition without losing their independence, which is rarer than it sounds. The written record of their kings begins in a moment of crisis next door. Around 168 BC, the 2nd book of Maccabees mentions Jewish refugees encountering Aretas, tyrant of the Arabs, the first Nabataean ruler history records by name, known to scholars as Aretas I. The Greek word tyrant simply meant a ruler outside the traditional royal lines. And the context tells us something important. The Nabataeans were already a power that neighbors negotiated with, sheltered under, and feared. Over the following century, the names accumulate into a dynasty. A king called Obodas I defeated the Judean ruler Alexander Jannaeus in battle around 93 BC, and likely crushed a Seleucid invasion a few years later. The victory was celebrated so intensely that after his death, the Nabataeans did something extraordinary. They worshipped him. Inscriptions and later Greek sources indicate that Obodas was venerated as a god, with a cult centered at a place still called Avdat in his honor. Few peoples deified their kings this way, and the choice shows how completely the old nomad equality was giving way to sacred monarchy. Then comes the reign that reveals the kingdom's ceiling. Around 84 BC, the exhausted citizens of Damascus, one of the great cities of Syria, caught between collapsing empires and dangerous neighbors, made a remarkable decision. According to the historian Josephus, they invited the Nabataean king Aretas III to rule them. Hold that image for a moment. A Greek-speaking metropolis, heir to centuries of urban civilization, voluntarily handed itself to the grandson of tent-dwelling caravan masters, because the desert kingdom had become the safest bet in the region. Aretas III understood exactly what the moment required, and answered in the language his new subjects respected. He minted coins in Damascus in the Greek style, stamped with his portrait and a Greek title, Phil Helena, friend of the Greeks. The message was aimed at every sophisticated skeptic in the Mediterranean. We are not barbarians at your gate. We are members of the club. Those coins open a window historians treasure, because coins are government documents you can hold in your hand. Nabataean silver shows a kingdom running its own monetary policy. And it shows something else, genuinely unusual for the ancient world. Later, Nabataean coins repeatedly present the queen beside the king. Named and crowned, queens such as Huldu and Shakilath appear on the money of the realm as partners in royal authority. Scholars debate how much practical power that reflected, and we should not romanticize it. But the pattern holds across generations, and it sits alongside other evidence of Nabataean women owning property and appearing in legal documents in their own names. Whatever the daily reality, the official face of this monarchy was, remarkably often, a double portrait. The kingdom also acquired the machinery that separates a state from a wealthy tribe. Officials with titles, garrisons. A royal court with ministers powerful enough that Greek writers knew their names. Strabo mentions a chief minister named Siculus, who dealt directly with Roman power, a man we will meet again under less flattering circumstances. And running through all of it, holding it together, was paperwork, which requires the thing this chapter has not yet named. Writing. To run warehouses and courts and treaties, you need a script. And the Nabataeans adapted the Aramaic alphabet, the script of that famous letter to Antigonus, into a distinctive cursive of their own, flowing, connected, built for speed rather than for monuments. They carved it on tombs and scratched it on rocks across their routes by the thousands. And those thousands of scratches would eventually matter more than anything else this kingdom produced. What became of that handwriting is one of the strangest afterlives in this entire story. And it is not obvious yet, so set it aside for now. We will come back to it. And when we do, 500 million people will turn out to be involved. Chapter 7. The Gods in the Stone. Walk through Petra today, and you will pass. Without noticing, dozens of small rectangular niches cut into the cliff walls. Each holds a plain block of stone, no face, no arms, no expression, just a rectangle, sometimes with a few carved lines suggesting eyes and a nose. More often, nothing at all. Those blocks are the gods. To visitors from the Greek and Roman world, this was the most alien thing about the Nabataeans. More alien than the tents, or the camels, or the desert. Greek religion was a gallery of beautiful human bodies in marble. Roman temples were crowded with statues you could look in the eye. Nabataean worship, at least in its older form, refused images almost entirely. Their gods were represented by betils, standing stones, from a Semitic phrase meaning house of the god, because the stone was not a portrait of the deity. It was a dwelling the deity could occupy. The chief god was Dushara, whose name appears to mean the one of Shara, referring to the mountain range around Petra, a god named after local geology, worshipped as a block of that geology. Beside him stood powerful goddesses, above all Al-Uzza, the mighty one, whom Greek and Roman observers tended to identify with Aphrodite or Isis, along with Alat and Manat, names that would remain familiar in Arabia for centuries afterward. Later, as Petra grew wealthy and cosmopolitan, images and Greco-Roman forms did creep into Nabataean religious art, and a few carvings show deities in human shape. But the old aniconic instinct never disappeared. In a world of statues, these people kept worshipping the mountain in the shape of a mountain, and they worshipped it high up, climbed the stairs cut into Jebel Madba, above the city center. And you reach a broad, artificial platform known as the Great High Place. levelled out of the summit, with a rectangular courtyard, altars, basins, and channels carved into the bare rock. Similar high places exist across the site, standing up there, with the whole valley laid out below and nothing overhead. It is very easy to understand the theology without a single word of text. Archaeologists debate what precisely happened on those platforms, and the basins and channels have been interpreted as serving libations, washing, or the drainage of blood from animal sacrifice. Certainty is not available. What the architecture makes unmistakable is the direction of the relationship. You went up to meet the gods, and the climb was part of the offering. Then there is the part of Nabataean religion that modern visitors find strangest, once explained, oddly beautiful. They ate with the dead. Scattered among Petra's tombs are chambers called triclinia, dining rooms cut into the rock, with stone benches running along 3 walls in the standard reclining arrangement of the ancient world. There are dozens of them, sometimes directly beside a tomb, sometimes carved into the cliff opposite. Inscriptions from Petra and from Hegra refer to religious dining associations, groups organized around shared banquets, and tomb inscriptions sometimes specify the arrangements for the feasts that were to be held there. So picture it as archaeologists reconstruct it. An illustrative scene rather than a recorded evening. A family gathers in a rock-cut room a few steps from a father's tomb. On the anniversary, lamps in wall niches, cushions on the stone benches, wine, and the smell of roasted meat, and the low echo that any carved chamber gives to voices. Children who never met the man in the tomb hear stories about him and are bored by some of them. Outside, the cliff face glows the color of skin in the late sun. The dead man is not gone. He is a member of the household with a permanent address. And once a year, the household comes to dinner. That single practice explains an enormous amount about the city. Petra's cliffs hold roughly 800 rock-cut tombs, and for a long time scholars called the whole valley a necropolis, a city of the dead. The triclinia complicate that description in the best way. These monuments were not built to be visited once and sealed. They were social architecture, designed for return, for meals, for family memory, maintained on a schedule. When you look at that famous facade at the end of the Sikh, you are probably not looking at a tomb in the modern sense of a closed box. You are looking at the front of a place where people expected to come back and eat. Freestanding temples existed too. In the city centre, though most are ruined now, one survives conspicuously, Qasr al-Bint, built of stacked stone rather than carved from rock, still stands near the heart of Petra, one of the very few freestanding Nabataean structures to survive the centuries and the earthquakes. Nearby stands the monumental complex conventionally called the Great Temple, excavated by a Brown University team over many seasons, whose function is still argued over. Temple, civic hall, or something in between. The debate remains open, which is itself a useful reminder. A structure can be excavated for decades and still refuse to say what it was for. And beneath all of it lies the fact that will matter at the end of this story. Only a portion of Petra's sacred landscape has ever been excavated, beyond the famous facades, beyond the high places with their worn stairs, The valley floor holds structures that have never been touched. Chapels and shrines and processional routes still under the sand. Whatever these people believed, the fullest evidence for it is still down there, waiting, and we will come back to what that means. For now, hold on to the image of the plain stone in the niche, a god with no face, in a room carved from a mountain, worshipped by traders who had grown rich on the smoke that rose from altars all over the Mediterranean. Those traders were about to spend their fortune making the mountain itself say who they were. Chapter 8. Carving Eternity. Every great city eventually writes its autobiography. Athens wrote in marble columns. Rome wrote in concrete and arches. The Nabataeans, when their moment came, looked at the sandstone cliffs surrounding their capital and made a decision that still stops people in their tracks 2,000 years later. They would not build their monuments. They would release them from the mountain. Understand what makes that choice strange. Construction, almost everywhere else, is addition. You gather stones and stack them. And if you make a mistake, you take the wall down and stack it again. Carving a building out of a cliff is subtraction. And subtraction is unforgiving. Every strike of the chisel is a decision that cannot be undone. Cut away too much, and there is no patch and no second attempt. Because the mountain does not grow back. The largest Nabataean facades stand well over 130 feet tall, covered in columns, pediments, and sculpted figures, all cut freehand from a single living wall of rock. Across years of work, the margin for error was close to zero. They did it dozens of times. No account survives of an ordinary working day on those cliffs. So what follows is a reconstruction, built from what archaeology tells us about the methods and the site. The light comes down the canyon wall in a slow line as the sun clears the ridge. Somewhere above, out of sight, iron rings against stone. Tink, 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 a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat and multiplied by dozens of hands. Rock dust drifts down through the sunbeams like snow that has forgotten how to be cold. A rope creaks. A basket of chippings swings out over the void and empties, and the plume drifts across the valley floor, powdering the market stalls and settling on the water jars. For the better part of 2 lifetimes. That sound was simply the sound of Petra, a city listening to itself being carved out of a mountain. How did they manage it without scaffolding as we know it? Archaeologists who studied Petra's unfinished tombs, and there are several, found the answer written into the abandoned work. The Nabataeans carved from the top down. Workers cut narrow footholds up the cliff, climbed to the level of the future rooftop, and began there, chiseling out a working ledge and sculpting the uppermost details first. Then they carved that ledge away beneath their own feet, descending band by band, finishing the facade as they went. The elegance of the method is that the workers stood on the uncarved rock below them. The mountain itself was the scaffolding. When they reached the ground, the scaffold was gone, because the scaffold had become the monument. The unfinished tombs freeze the process mid-motion. Crowns fully detailed at the top, raw cliff below. Like a photograph developing from the top edge down, The stone rewarded them as no stacked masonry ever could. Petra's sandstone is layered in bands of colour: rose and salmon, honey and cream, streaks of blue-grey and ripples of crimson, laid down by iron and minerals over millions of years. Cut into it, and the patterns pour across walls and ceilings like liquid marble. The Victorian traveller Edward Lear recorded his cook taking one look at the place and declaring that they had entered a world of chocolate, ham, curry powder, and salmon, which may be the most honest art criticism the valley ever received. The famous phrase, "the rose-red city," is not a metaphor. It is a mineral fact. All of it leads to the building you have already seen. Whether you know it or not, Al-Ghazneh, the Treasury, the facade that appears at the end of the Sikh in 1,000 films and photographs, nearly 130 feet of carved precision, 2 stories of columns crowned by a broken pediment and a central rotunda, guarded by sculpted gods and Amazons, and positioned with theatrical intent directly opposite the canyon's exit, so that every arriving traveller, after half a mile of cold shadow, steps into sunlight and finds it waiting. It is a staged reveal engineered into geology, and it has been working on visitors for 2,000 years. The name, though, is a later invention, and an instructive one. No evidence supports the legend that gave the building its title, a story that a pharaoh hid gold inside the great stone urn at the top of the facade. For generations, hopeful riflemen shot at that urn trying to crack it open. The bullet scars are still visible. The urn is solid rock. So what was the building? Scholars still debate it. Proposals have included a temple and a royal monument. But the strongest current evidence points toward a tomb. Excavations beneath the facade in 2003 uncovered burial chambers below the plaza floor. And many specialists, following the architectural study by the scholar Judith Mackenzie, date the monument to the reign of King Aratus IV. Around the turn of the 1st century AD, that would make it plausibly the mausoleum of Petra's greatest king. Plausibly, no inscription names its owner, and certainty is not available. Deeper into the valley stands the Treasury's sibling, Ad-Deir, the monastery, larger and broader than the Treasury, reached today by a climb of roughly 800 rock-cut steps. Its name is also a later label, taken from crosses scratched inside by Byzantine monks centuries after the carvers were gone. An inscription found nearby suggests a connection to the deified king Obodas, which would make this remote high place not a monastery at all, but a monument of the royal cult. The pattern repeats across the whole site. Nearly every name the modern world uses for Petra's buildings is a guess made by later strangers, while the builder's own words are almost entirely silent here. We call these facades architecture, but they function as rhetoric. A nation of former nomads, still dismissed by Greek and Roman snobs as desert Arabs, carved Greek columns, Egyptian crowns, and Mesopotamian motifs into cliffs at a scale that marble cities struggled to match, blending the styles of the age into something none of those civilizations would have made alone. The message aimed at every merchant and envoy walking out of the Sikh was simple. You thought you were visiting a campsite. Look up. And they were saying it at precisely the moment a new power arrived in the East. one that did not send 4,000 men and go home when the desert got difficult, one that was retiring the region's kingdoms, one at a time. Chapter 9. Dancing with Rome. In the year 64 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great arrived in Syria and did something that had become almost routine for him. He abolished a 300-year-old empire, the Seleucid dynasty, heir to the largest share of Alexander's conquests, was dissolved with roughly the effort of closing a bankrupt shop, and its lands became a Roman province. Every kingdom in the region understood the message. The era of independent power in the East was ending. The only question left for kings was what kind of ending they would get. The first test came almost immediately. In Judea, two brothers were fighting over a throne, and the Nabataean king Aretas III backed one of them with an army, marching into Judea and besieging Jerusalem itself. That was exactly the sort of independent foreign policy Rome did not permit. A Roman officer ordered Aretas to withdraw, and he did. But Pompey resolved to punish the desert kingdom anyway. In 62 BC, his lieutenant Marcus Aemilius Scaurus marched on Petra. The campaign bogged down in the waterless approaches, the same defense that had broken Demetrius 2.5 centuries earlier. And then, before any decisive battle, the Nabataeans made a business decision. According to Josephus, they paid Scaurus 300 talents of silver, and the Roman army went away. Scaurus went home and advertised a victory anyway. He minted coins in Rome, showing the Nabataean king kneeling beside a camel. Pure political theatre. The Nabataeans, as far as we can tell, did not object at all. Rome got the pose. Petra kept the kingdom. It was the letter to Antigonus all over again. Win the substance. Concede the optics. And let the great power save face. It had worked on Macedonians. It now worked on Romans. That became the formula for a century. Pay tribute when demanded. Supply troops and grain to Roman campaigns, including cavalry for Julius Caesar in Egypt. Swallow provocations that would have driven prouder kingdoms into suicidal wars. Not every episode went smoothly, and one of them produced a genuine mystery. Around 26 BC, the Emperor Augustus sent an expedition into Arabia under a general named Aelius Gallus. Aiming at the incense lands themselves, the Nabataean chief minister, Silaus, the man we met in the last chapter, went along as guide. The expedition was a disaster. The army wandered, ran short of water, sickened, and eventually turned back without taking the incense country. Strabo, whose friend commanded that army, blamed Silaus directly, accusing him of leading the Romans astray on purpose to protect Nabataean trade interests. Modern historians are more cautious, since Strabo had every reason to prefer treachery to incompetence as an explanation, and the logistics were brutal regardless. Silaus later went to Rome on his own political business, became entangled in the affairs of Herod's court, and was executed there. Whether he was a saboteur or a scapegoat, the episode captures the position perfectly. The Nabataeans were useful enough to be invited on imperial adventures, and suspect enough to be blamed when the adventures failed. The neighborhood was poisonous in other directions too. To the west sat Herod the Great, Rome's client king of Judea, a brilliant and paranoid builder whose own mother, according to Josephus, was Nabataean, and whose relationship with Petra swung between kinship and open war. The two kingdoms fought border wars in the 30s BC, and again decades later, each side sponsoring raids and rebels against the other. Two clients competing for the same patron's favor like rival siblings. Behind one of those wars stood Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, at the height of her influence over Mark Antony, persuaded him to strip territories from Rome's eastern clients for her benefit. And both Herod and the Nabataeans lost valuable lands and revenues to her. Josephus reports that when the two kingdoms then went to war with each other, Cleopatra's general quietly worked to keep the fighting going, because she profited while both sides bled. It is a useful correction to the romantic Cleopatra of film, to the kingdoms east of the Jordan. She was not a love story. She was a competitor with better political access. Then, in 31 BC, the chessboard flipped in an afternoon. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was destroyed at Actium, and the Nabataeans read the new reality with their usual speed. When the defeated queen tried to haul her surviving ships overland toward the Red Sea, hoping to slip beyond Rome's reach, Nabataean forces burned those ships on the shore, partly revenge, unmistakably also a message to the winner. The Desert Kingdom was already on the new emperor's side. The long reign that followed, under Aretas IV, from roughly 9 BC to 40 AD, became the golden age we have been walking through. The age of the Treasury, of peak trade, of queens on the coinage, of Hagra's inscribed tombs rising in the southern desert. And from those exact years comes a detail that connects Petra to a book sitting in millions of American homes. The Apostle Paul, recounting his early ministry in his second letter to the Corinthians, writes that in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city to arrest him, and that he escaped by being lowered through a window in the wall in a basket. The King Aretas of the New Testament is Aretas the fourth of Petra. The passage suggests some form of Nabataean authority or representation in Damascus in the mid-30s AD, though historians still debate exactly what that authority was, whether territorial control, oversight of a Nabataean community, or something in between. However it is read, the man whose letters shaped Christianity spent one desperate night dangling from a rope on the Damascus wall, and the power he was escaping answered in some fashion to a desert capital most of his readers would never see. Most Bible readers pass over the name Aretas without ever knowing there is a lost civilization standing behind it. Look at the full century: Pompey, Caesar, Cleopatra, Herod, Augustus. Every one of those names ended kingdoms, and several of them ended each other. Through all of it, the Nabataeans kept their crown, their capital, their trade, and their gods, not through weakness, but through a disciplined humility that history rarely rewards this well. Call it the strategy of the reed. The proud oaks of the East were felled one by one. The reed bent with every storm, and was still standing when the storms had names like emperors. But a reed survives only as long as the river permits. Rome's patience with client kingdoms was not a policy. It was a phase. Chapter 10. The Quiet Annexation. some kingdoms die screaming. Carthage burned for 17 days. Jerusalem fell in fire and slaughter, and Rome carved the triumph onto an arch that still stands in the city today. Ancient historians loved those endings and built careers on them, which is why the end of the Nabataean kingdom is one of the strangest events in Roman history. In the year 106 AD, a kingdom that had lasted more than 4 centuries stopped existing, and almost nobody wrote down how. What the record gives us is startlingly thin. The historian Cassius Dio, writing about a century later, devotes a single line to it, saying that around this time Cornelius Palma, the governor of Syria, subdued the part of Arabia around Petra and made it subject to the Romans. That is essentially all. No battle is named. No siege is described. No king is paraded through Rome in chains. So what happened? The honest answer requires the conditional voice, because scholars have argued about this for generations. The last Nabataean king, Rabel II, appears to have died in 106 AD, and the annexation followed almost immediately. Some scholars suspect an arrangement made in advance of a kind Rome used elsewhere, in which a client king ruled for life on the understanding that his kingdom would pass to Rome at his death. Others point to scattered evidence. A Roman military document here, a later reference there, suggesting localized resistance and perhaps brief fighting in some towns. What archaeologists have not found is evidence of a large, destructive war across the kingdom. No burn layers in the cities from this date. Numas graves. And when Rome eventually minted coins for the new province, the chosen word was telling: Arabia adquisita, Arabia acquired, not captured. Acquired, the way you acquire a going concern, keeping the staff who know how it runs. That word may be the truest surviving document. Consider what Rome was actually taking over. Not farmland, not mines. A network of routes, wells, customs posts, and trading relationships. And a network only has value if the people running it keep running it. Whatever legal form the annexation took, the reality on the ground appears to have been continuity. The same caravan masters, the same water engineers, the same merchant families, a new flag over the crossroads. And here we have something close to miraculous. An actual voice from ground level. In 1961, archaeologists exploring a cave near the Dead Sea, where refugees from a later revolt had hidden, found the private legal archive of a woman named Babatha, a Jewish landowner who lived on the edge of the old Nabataean world. Her documents, dozens of them preserved on papyrus, run from before the annexation to after it, and they show ordinary life continuing straight across the great political divide. Property deeds, marriage contracts, loans, a long, bitter lawsuit over an orphaned son's maintenance. In her files, Nabataean scribes keep writing, Nabataean neighbors keep farming, and the new Roman courts simply become the next venue for the same family arguments. Empire change. Paperwork is forever. Petra itself was not humiliated by the new order. Rome built a great highway, the Via Nova Traiana, running from Syria to the Red Sea straight through the former kingdom. The Emperor Trajan granted Petra the title of metropolis. His successor Hadrian visited in person around 130 AD, and the city styled itself Hadrian Petra in his honor. The theatre kept its audiences. The temples kept their gods. Standing in the colonnaded street in 150 AD, you might reasonably have concluded that the Nabataeans had pulled off their finest trick yet, surviving their own annexation. But beneath the marble surface, something was shifting, and it is the part of this story I find most haunting. Because it was not a defeat. It was a redirection. Petra's wealth had always rested on a geographic fact, that goods crossing from Arabia and India toward the Mediterranean moved by camel, through the desert, through Nabataean hands. By the 2nd century AD, that fact was dissolving, and not for one reason, but for several at once. Sailors had long since mastered the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, and under the Roman peace the sea trade boomed, with ships running from Egypt's Red Sea ports to India and back. One vessel carrying what hundreds of camels carried, and paying no fee at every well. In the north, the caravan city of Palmyra rose to capture the routes running through Persia, an oasis power growing rich at the game Petra had invented. Roman roads and Roman administration redrew the map of where goods and money flowed. Tastes and religious practice slowly changed too, and the enormous appetite for incense that had built this city did not last forever. No single blow landed. Traffic simply found other ways to move. The world does not attack you. It stops needing to pass through you. Rome did not destroy Petra in 106 AD. Over the following centuries, the sea lanes, the new rivals, and the redrawn roads drained away the advantage the city's fortune had been built on, and the monsoon winds helped do what Roman armies never had. Petra remained a real city, though, and cities do not vanish because profits fall. They adapt, shrink, repurpose, and endure, sometimes for centuries. What broke this one was not economics at all. It came from underneath. On a spring afternoon, in the year 363. Chapter 11. Earthquake and the Long Fading. The Jordan Rift Valley, the great trench that holds the Dead Sea, is one of the most restless pieces of geology on Earth. Two tectonic plates grind past each other along its length, and they do not move smoothly. They stick, load up centuries of strain, and release it all at once. The people of Petra had always lived with tremors. What arrived on May 19th, in the year 363 AD, was different in kind. Nobody wrote an eyewitness account of that afternoon in Petra. So picture the ordinary version of it, reconstructed from the ruins themselves. Market hour, awnings up against the sun, the colonnaded street full of the noise any street makes. Animals. Argument. Someone's cartwheel complaining. Then a sound with no source, low, coming up through the soles of the feet rather than through the air. The water in the open jars goes strange. Dust jumps off ledges that have held it for 100 years. And then the columns. Those beautiful straight lines of the Roman city. Lean together like men who have had too much wine, and come down across the paving in a rolling crash that lasts far longer than anyone would expect, followed by the second sound, the sound of a whole city's roof tiles arriving at once, and then a silence with screaming inside it. We know the date with unusual precision because of a remarkable document, a letter attributed to Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, describing a catastrophic earthquake that struck the region that spring and listing the cities damaged. The list is long, and on it, reported as more than half destroyed, is Petra. Archaeology backs the letter. Excavators have found that afternoon's fingerprint across the site. Columns, lying in rows like fallen soldiers, all toppled the same direction. Roofs collapsed onto floors, and in at least one excavated quarter, human remains crushed beneath fallen stone. People who did not get out. Many of the rock-cut facades came through better than the freestanding city. A monument carved into a cliff moves with the cliff, which is one reason the Treasury still stands nearly intact, though the carved tombs suffered damage and cracking too, and have been losing surface ever since. It was the built city that took the worst of it. The city of columns, markets, and houses. The damage also reached the thing that mattered most. Parts of the hydraulic network cracked and failed. Some channels and basins were repaired and stayed in use. Archaeology shows that clearly. But a system like Petra's was never something you could half maintain. It demanded constant labor and constant money. And both were thinner now than in the golden centuries. From that afternoon onward, the city lived with a wounded water system in a land that forgives nothing. And yet, this is where history beats legend. Petra had another act, and until recently historians barely knew it existed. The old story held that after the earthquake, the city dwindled into a ghost town of squatters. Then, in December of 1993, excavators working in the burned ruins of a Byzantine church above the city centre found a room containing what looked like lumps of charcoal. They were papyrus scrolls, about 140 of them, carbonized by an ancient fire, which is the only reason they survived at all. Fire had sealed them. Specialists spent years unrolling and reading what became known as the Petra Papyri, the private archive of a prominent local family, covering much of the 6th century. The city, those documents reveal, is not a ghost town. It is alive. Landowners with vineyards and orchards in the hills, marriages, inheritances, tax records, property swaps, and disputes among relatives that any modern family would recognize. Church officials with Greek titles and local names, a functioning provincial town, smaller and humbler than the caravan capital, but organized, literate, Christian, and stubbornly present. 2 centuries after its supposed death, Christian Petra is its own strange and moving chapter. The city that had worshipped Dushara in the shape of a plain stone became a bishop's seat. Some great tombs were converted into churches. Crosses cut into walls that had been carved for other gods, which is how Ad-Der earned the name it still carries. New churches rose in the center, floored with mosaics of camels, lions, and the personified seasons, some of which visitors walk past today. Imagine one of those services. Again, as a reconstruction rather than a record. Mourning. In a basilica with a mosaic floor. The old carved cliffs standing outside the doorway exactly as they have for 400 years. The congregation is not large. Incense goes up because the new faith uses it too. In a city that once shipped it to the altars of the old gods by the ton, voices echo off stone that was quarried by people whose language these worshippers can still read, but whose gods they no longer name. Somewhere behind the church, up the valley, the tombs of the kings stand open and empty, their dining rooms silent. Nobody in the room thinks of themselves as living at the end of anything. They think of themselves as living in Petra, which is simply the place where they live. But the papyri, read closely, show a community facing inward, living from its gardens and terraced fields rather than from the roads. The great roots ran elsewhere. Then the earth moved again. In July of 551 AD, another major earthquake struck the region, recorded by Byzantine chroniclers. And somewhere in these decades came the fire that burned the church, and in burning it baked the family archive into charcoal and preserved it for us. The latest documents in the archive date to the 580s or the early 590s. After that, silence. Within a generation or two, the threads thinned. Armies of the new Islamic Caliphate redrew the political map in the 630s, and the commerce of the New Age flowed along pilgrimage and market roads on which a damaged city inside a mountain no longer held any special place. No chronicle records an evacuation, because there was nothing so dramatic. Families left one by one, in the ordinary way, for the ordinary reasons. Water was easier elsewhere. Work was elsewhere. Life was elsewhere. The people of this story began as nomads whose law forbade building, because anything built can be taken from you. 6 centuries later, their descendants lived out the deeper version of that warning. Anything built must also be maintained, forever, by somebody, or it stops being shelter and becomes scenery. A city is not its stones. A city is the daily, invisible labor of thousands of hands keeping the stones alive. And when the hands grow few, even a wonder begins turning back into geology. In the centuries that followed, Bedouin communities lived in and around the valley, grazing goats among the ruins, sheltering in the caves, drawing water where water still ran. To them, the place was never lost. It was home. Chapter 12. Crusaders. Then silence. For most of the medieval centuries, Petra appears in Western records about as often as a city that does not exist. There is one brief exception, one strange episode when armored Europeans stood inside the valley, walked past the Treasury, and left almost no word about it. In the year 1099, Crusader armies took Jerusalem and carved out a kingdom in the Holy Land. Any ruler of Jerusalem, looking at a map, eventually notices what the Romans and the Nabataeans had noticed. The roads east of the Jordan matter. Caravans and pilgrims moving between Damascus and Egypt had to pass through that corridor, and whoever sat on it could tax it or choke it. So, in the early 1100s, King Baldwin I pushed south and east into the old Nabataean heartland, and the Crusaders built castles there, the greatest Montreal, rose in 1115 near the ancient road, and a smaller garrison post was planted inside the valley of Petra itself. Its remains still crown a rock outcrop above the city centre. A crude little fort of reused ancient stones standing among monuments it never tried to explain. Crusader documents called the district by a biblical name, the Vale of Moses. Remembering the spring, the knights knew the water, about the civilization. Their surviving records show little curiosity at all. That silence is worth sitting with. Carefully, these Europeans garrisoned the middle of one of the ancient world's great architectural achievements, and their letters and chronicles discuss castles, revenue, and battles, while of the carved city itself they say essentially nothing that survives. No Crusader account marvels at the Treasury. Perhaps some soldier stood in front of it and wondered, and simply never wrote it down. We cannot know. What we can say is that seeing is not the same as understanding. You can stand before a wonder and, lacking the story, see only rock. The Crusader moment lasted barely 2 generations. In 1187, Saladin destroyed the Crusader field army at the Battle of Hattin, and the isolated castles east of the Jordan were doomed. Montreal held out under a long siege before surrendering, and the region passed back into the Islamic world. Where it was better known, Arab geographers of the following centuries wrote of the Valley of Moses and its spring. The shrine of Aaron on the summit above Petra was maintained and revered, and a sultan of Egypt is recorded to have made a pilgrimage there in the 1200s. Local people lived, farmed, herded, and prayed across this landscape without interruption. Petra was never lost to the people of Petra. The word lost, which the whole world uses, and which this story has used, is accurate only from one narrow point of view, Europe's. But that narrow point of view is itself a genuine historical fact, and a strange one. After the Crusaders withdrew, Western European travel into this interior region became extremely limited, and Europe's direct knowledge of it faded. What remained was a mixture of Bible geography, classical texts, and imagination. Scholars reading Strabo and Pliny knew that a great city called Petra had existed somewhere beyond the Jordan. Mapmakers dutifully wrote the name into empty deserts, guessing, often wildly wrong. The city became a ghost of literature, a name without coordinates, a place learned men could discuss at dinner with no confidence that it still physically existed. More than 6 centuries passed that way. Printing was invented. America was colonized. Newton wrote his laws. And through all of it, one of the most spectacular places on Earth received no documented European visitor, because the civilization that would one day put its picture on 1 million posters had misplaced the address. What ended the silence was not an army, it was the age of scientific exploration, and one young man in particular, riding south through Jordan in the summer of 1812 under a name that was not his own. Chapter 13. The Impostor Pilgrim. His real name was Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. Born in Lausanne in 1784 to a wealthy Basel family battered by the Napoleonic Wars. He went to England looking for a career and found one of the strangest on offer. A London organization called the African Association was recruiting explorers for a mission that had already killed several men, reaching the fabled city of Timbuktu across the Sahara. Burckhardt signed on, and then made a decision that set him apart from nearly every explorer of his age. He concluded that surviving years of travel in the Muslim world required more than a costume and a few phrases. It required preparation so deep that the disguise would function, in practice, as a second life. That preparation took years, and its discipline still astonishes. He studied Arabic at Cambridge, then moved to Aleppo in Syria and spent over 2 years perfecting it, studying the Quran and Islamic law seriously enough to hold his own under questioning by scholars. He dressed, ate, and lived as a local, took the name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, and hardened his body with long marches and rough living. Modern readers can feel the moral complexity here. A European using a false identity to open doors that were closed to Europeans, in the service of a London institution. And that discomfort is legitimate. It is also true that his method rested on serious study of the culture he moved through, and that learned men who examined him came away satisfied. Both things are true at once. That tension is simply what he was. In 1812, Burckhardt set out from Damascus toward Cairo by the inland route through Jordan, territory almost no European had documented. Somewhere on that road, he began hearing local talk of extraordinary ruins in the mountains near the tomb of Aaron, in a valley called Wadi Musa. He connected the talk with the ancient geographers he knew by heart and suspected what might be hiding there. The problem was getting in. A wandering stranger asking to inspect ruins would have been suspected at once of hunting treasure. And in that time and place, suspicion could turn dangerous quickly. His solution was quiet and clever. He declared a religious vow, telling his guide he had pledged to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, on the mountain above the hidden valley. The only path to the tomb led through the ruins, and a vow was an explanation far less suspicious than curiosity. So on August 22nd, 1812, a local guide led the disguised traveller, goat in tow, into the Sikh. Burckhardt walked that half-mile of shadowed canyon and came out, like every visitor since, facing the Treasury. As far as records show, he was the first European in more than 6 centuries to stand there, and he could not stop, could not sketch, could not even stare too long. His guide was watching, and strangers who lingered over ruins were assumed to be after gold. The bullet-scarred urn overhead was proof of how seriously people held that belief. So he kept walking, glancing, memorizing, a man performing indifference in front of the most astonishing thing he had ever seen. That night, and in the days after, he wrote it up in secret, in the cramped hand of someone who cannot afford to be caught writing. He recorded the Treasury, the theatre, the tombs, and then set down the sentence that ended 6 centuries of Western silence, noting that it appeared very probable that the ruins of Wadi Musa were those of the ancient Petra. Then he climbed toward Aaron's tomb and sacrificed his goat as dusk came on, a real offering completing a false vow, and left the valley the same day. He had spent only hours inside. Those hours put a wonder back on the map of the world. Burckhardt never saw Europe again, and never saw his own fame. He went on to document the great temple of Abu Simbel in Egypt, performed the pilgrimage to Mecca, and died of dysentery in Cairo in 1817, at 32 years old, still waiting for the Sahara caravan that never departed. He was buried under his Muslim name. His journals, published after his death, moved quietly through educated Europe and changed what people believed was out there. The artists came next. In 1839, the Scottish painter David Roberts spent days sketching in Petra, and the lithographs published from his drawings became a sensation in Britain. This is how Petra entered the Victorian living room, in tinted stone colours, camels in the foreground, facades soaring like opera sets. The image seized the English-speaking imagination so completely that in 1845 it produced the line that still follows the city everywhere. A young clergyman named John William Burgon won Oxford's Newdigate Prize with a poem calling Petra a rose-red city half as old as time. The line outlived the poem, and it carries one perfect irony. Burgon had not been to Petra when he wrote it. The most quoted description of the place was composed from other people's pictures. Behind the poets came the measurers, and what those patient people found in the rock turned out to matter more than the facades that had drawn them there. Chapter 14. The Letters That Outlived the Kingdom. Petra's monuments are famous for being silent. No inscription names the owner of the treasury. No plaque records who ordered the monastery. But that silence is a trick of the location, because the Nabataeans were not a people who failed to write. They were a people who wrote constantly in the wrong places for fame. They wrote on rocks, across the deserts of Jordan, the Negev, the Sinai, and northern Arabia. Nabataean inscriptions survive by the thousands, scratched onto boulders and cliff faces along the caravan roads. Most are short and utterly ordinary. Anami, a father's name, a prayer that a god remember someone for good, the equivalent of a driver's initials on a rest stop wall, repeated across an empire of small places, by men waiting out the heat of the afternoon with a sharp stone in hand. For centuries, those marks were unreadable to outsiders. European travellers in the 1700s and 1800s noticed strange flowing characters everywhere in the Sinai and speculated wildly about their origin, including a popular theory that they were messages left by the Israelites of the Exodus. The truth was less biblical and more interesting. The script was a cursive descendant of Aramaic, the administrative language of the old Near East, and scholars familiar with Aramaic letterforms began working out the correspondences in the 1800s. Once the alphabet cracked, the desert started talking. What followed was one of the great unglamorous achievements of 19th and 20th century scholarship. Epigraphers copied inscriptions by the thousand. At Hegra, in Wadi Rum, in the Sinai, at Bosra, at Petra itself, and slowly rebuilt a civilization out of graffiti and tombstones. The kings of chapter 6 emerged from those texts. So did the queens on the coins, the names of gods, the titles of officials, the legal formulas protecting a family tomb. The fact that a woman could commission a monument in her own name. The Nabataeans left no history books, no epic, no chronicle. They left receipts, prayers, and property law. And out of that debris, scholars reassembled the people. Then the epigraphers noticed something else. And this is where a regional kingdom becomes a global story. The Nabataean script changed over time, and it changed in a particular direction, because it was cursive, written quickly with a reed on soft material and then copied onto stone. Its letters began to run together and simplify. Forms merged. Shapes flattened into connected sequences. Compare an inscription from the 1st century BC with one from 3 or 4 centuries later, and you are watching a script slide, generation by generation, towards something else. 2 texts anchor the story. At Hegra, there is a tomb inscription dated to the year 267 AD, commissioned by a woman named Rakush, which epigraphers regularly cite as showing letterforms already well along the road from Nabataean towards something new. Further north, the famous Namara inscription of 328 AD, an epitaph for an Arab king, is written in the Nabataean script but in the Arabic language. One of the earliest substantial Arabic texts we possess. Later inscriptions from the 5th and 6th centuries continue the transition, until the letters arrive at a form that any reader of Arabic today would begin to recognize. Scholars debate the details, as they should, and other regional traditions may have contributed along the way. But the broad conclusion is widely accepted. The cursive Nabataean tradition is the principal ancestor of the Arabic script. Take a moment with the size of that. The kingdom in this story was small. Its army never conquered a great power. Its capital emptied and was forgotten by half the world. And yet more than 400 million people write Arabic today. And the same alphabet carries Persian, Urdu, Pashto, and other languages besides, which pushes the number of people using letters descended from that desert cursive well past 500 million. The signs above shops from Casablanca to Karachi, the calligraphy on mosque walls, the text of the Quran itself, all of it descends most directly from the working handwriting of Petra's caravan clerks. There is a lesson in that about what survives and why. These people spent fortunes carving 100-foot facades into cliffs. And those facades did make them immortal in a certain way. As scenery, what actually propagated, what spread across continents and is used by 500 million people every day without a thought, was the thing they never intended as a monument at all. The fast, practical, slightly sloppy handwriting they used for invoices and property deeds, and quick prayers scratched beside a desert road. The monuments got the tourists. The paperwork got the world. Chapter 15. Indiana Jones and the Price of Fame. In the spring of 1989, audiences settled into theaters for the 3rd Indiana Jones film, The Last Crusade. In its final act, Harrison Ford and Sean Connery ride through a narrow, winding canyon of stone and emerge before a colossal carved temple where the Grail waits inside. All over the world, people asked the same 2 questions. Where is that? Is it real? The canyon was the Sikh. The temple was the Treasury. Petra had just given the performance of its life, playing itself, in front of a global mass audience. It is easy to be snobbish about that, and wrong to be. Burckhardt's journals reached thousands of readers. Roberts's lithographs reached tens of thousands of parlors. A few minutes of film reached more people than both combined had reached in a century and a half. And the association has never faded. Guides in the sick still hear the same joke a dozen times a morning. And stalls near the Treasury still sell fedoras. Scholars give us knowledge. Movies give us longing. Longing is what buys plane tickets. The film was the loudest note in a chord that had been building for years. In 1985, UNESCO inscribed Petra as a World Heritage Site, formal recognition that the city is held in trust for all of humanity. In 1994, Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty. The region opened, and tourism to Jordan surged. Then, in 2007, came the marketing coronation, a global campaign called the New Seven Wonders of the World, decided by an announced total of around 100 million votes cast by the public. With Petra named among the winners beside the Great Wall and Machu Picchu, historians can argue about what such campaigns really measure, and they do. The effect is not in question. Visitor numbers climbed year after year, and by 2019, according to Jordanian tourism figures, more than 1 million people were walking the Sikh annually. For Jordan, a young kingdom without the oil wealth of its neighbors. This was transformational. Petra became the anchor of an industry that grew into one of the country's largest earners, supporting hotels, drivers, guides, and craft sellers across the whole south. In a sense, the city returned to its oldest business, sitting on a route the world wanted to travel and collecting value from those passing through. Only the product had changed, from incense to experience. But fame always sends a bill, and the largest share of this one was paid by the people who had been living in the valley all along, for generations. Families of the Badul tribe had lived inside Petra itself, in the caves and tombs, herding goats among the ruins, drawing water where the Nabataeans had drawn it. They were the valley's living inhabitants, the human thread connecting the ancient city to the modern one. In the 1980s, as the national park took shape and World Heritage status approached, the government resettled them out of the ruins into a purpose-built village called Seyhun on the hill above the site. The move came with houses, schools, electricity, and clinics. Real benefits that many families wanted. It was framed as protecting the monuments, and there was truth in that framing. But testimonies gathered by researchers over the years record the other side. Elders grieving for cave homes their families had held for generations. And a community transformed within a few years, from herders living inside their own landscape into service workers commuting into it, selling camel rides and souvenirs in what had been their living rooms. In 2005, UNESCO proclaimed the cultural traditions of the Bedouin of this region a masterpiece of intangible human heritage. The world honored the culture in the same generation that the culture's home address was changed. This deserves fairness rather than easy outrage, because it is a genuinely hard problem. 1 million visitors a year and open cooking fires in ancient tombs cannot share the same rooms. Conservation is real, and Jordan's stewardship of Petra is, by international standards, serious. But there is a pattern here that repeats across the modern world, from national parks to heritage cities on every continent, in which the final cost of preserving a place is quietly billed to the people who never left it. The Nabataeans were traders who became a monument. The Badul were residents who became a workforce. Both were rearranged by forces larger than themselves, and only one of them got to carve their answer into the cliffs. So this is Petra at its modern height, a World Heritage plaque at the gate. Movie fame in every visitor's pocket, 1 million pairs of shoes a year on the ancient paving, an economy and a national identity leaning on a city that emptied out more than 1,000 years ago. From outside, it looks like the happiest possible ending. The lost city found, loved, and funded, but the desert has not stopped being the desert. The rock has not stopped being soft. The city that survived being forgotten now faces a stranger test. Can it survive being remembered? Chapter 16. The Second Disappearance. On a November afternoon in 2018, the sky over southern Jordan turned dark and the old enemy came back. Torrential rain hit the highlands, and the water began to gather and run, funneling toward the canyons exactly as it has for 1 million years. Within hours, flash floods were tearing through the region, and authorities scrambled to evacuate close to 4,000 tourists from Petra as water surged toward the Sikh. In the wider region that week, the floods killed more than 12 people. Petra's visitors escaped, shaken but safe. And the reason deserves to be said plainly. Modern dams, drainage, and warning procedures guard the entrance now. Rebuilt on the footprint of the Nabataean works, the ancient engineers were proven right one more time. Their system, or its modern echo, is still what stands between the crowds and the water. That afternoon is an honest introduction to Petra's present, because every threat the city ever faced is still here. And fame has added new ones. The rock itself is the first problem. Petra's sandstone, soft enough to carve, is soft in every direction, and it does not distinguish between a chisel and a fingertip. Conservation scientists have documented the slow damage, salt crystallizing inside the stone and flaking it apart, wind and rain gnawing at column bases, moisture and handling wearing at surfaces within reach. Researchers monitoring the site have warned that some facades are visibly losing their crisp edges within single human lifetimes. Nothing dramatic happens on any given day. That is exactly the danger. Erosion, like the fading of the caravan trade, is a catastrophe with no date on it. The kind of ending nobody notices until it has already happened. The second problem is us. Tourism rescued Petra from obscurity and funds its protection. And tourism also delivers. On peak days, enormous crowds through a canyon that was engineered for caravans. Managing that flood of admiration has become its own discipline, with Jordanian authorities and organizations such as the Petra National Trust working on visitor routing, conservation, and education. Anyone who tells you there is a simple answer is selling one. Petra now lives inside a permanent balancing act, between access and preservation, between the economy of the living and the fabric of the dead. And the balance has to be struck again every morning. And yet, if this were only a story about decay, it would be a false one, because the most remarkable fact about Petra in our century points the other way. The city is still giving. In 2016, the archaeologists Sarah Parkak and Christopher Tuttle, using satellite imagery and drone photography, identified a large monumental platform buried barely half a mile from the city centre, a structure that generations of scholars had walked past without recognizing under the sand and scrub. In 2024, an excavation beneath the area in front of the Treasury itself, the most photographed ground in the country, revealed a chamber holding the remains of about a dozen people along with grave goods, apparently undisturbed since antiquity. The find made headlines worldwide, and some archaeologists soon cautioned that the coverage exaggerated how unexpected it was, since burials were already known beneath that plaza. Both things can be true. The discovery was less shocking to specialists than to newspapers, and it still proves the essential point. We are still finding the dead under the most famous doorstep in the Middle East. Large parts of Petra's archaeological landscape remain unexcavated or only partially studied, and everything 2 centuries of work has uncovered is a fraction of what the valley holds. The high places, the shrines, the processional routes, the ordinary houses of the ordinary people who made all of this run. Most of that is still down there, under the sand, waiting for methods that have not been invented yet. Go to the sick early enough, before the gates open and the crowds come, and the valley returns for an hour to something like its own scale. Cold air pooled in the canyon overnight. Guards and horse handlers moving through in 1s and 2s, their voices carrying oddly against the walls. The channel that carried spring water for 400 years, running along at shoulder height, dry, still perfectly graded, light climbing down the eastern wall very slowly. The way it did for the carvers and for the caravans and for the young man with the goat, and then the gap at the end, and the facade waiting in shadow, and the strange fact that it is doing precisely what it was designed to do, to whoever happens to be standing there. 2,000 years after the last Nabataean architect went home for the evening, Burckhardt believed, reasonably, that he had found Petra. 2 centuries of scholarship have returned a stranger verdict. He found the front door, the kingdom behind that door, the flood farmers and the water engineers, the letter writers and the queens on the silver coins, the families who ate dinner beside their dead, the clerks whose fast handwriting became the ancestor of the Arabic script. All of that was recovered slowly, generation by generation, by Jordanian, European, and American hands, reading papyri out of burned churches and platforms out of satellite photographs. The recovery is nowhere near finished. The Nabataeans never wrote their own history, or if they did, the desert has not returned it yet. What they left instead was a demonstration, carved at the scale of mountains, that knowledge can outlast power, that water can defeat armies, that a people everyone underestimated could build something none of their conquerors equaled, and that even being forgotten is not necessarily the end. Their city outlived their kingdom, outlived their gods, outlived their name in Western memory, and then came back. Somewhere under the sand of that valley, the odds are good that their story is still waiting. In chambers, no one has opened. In papyri, no fire has found. In inscriptions, no eye has read since the incense roads went quiet. The West lost Petra for centuries. The people of Petra never did, and the valley itself has not finished telling us what it is. Thank you for making this journey with us. If this story stayed with you, the next lost world is already waiting.